Good morning, Mr. Summers. Thanks for your time. A central bank's responsibility these days is to reduce inflation without causing a recession. This means a soft landing. Is the Fed doing the job, and what should be its next step in shaping interest rates?
I'm certainly more optimistic about a soft landing than I was a year ago. It appears that growth will certainly remain relatively robust through 2023, and it looks okay coming into 2024. Nonetheless, inflation and inflation expectations have come down. So it appears that either supply developments have moved in favorable directions or that expectations have done a good job of remaining anchored, and we haven't seen the kind of spiral that we might have feared. I think that's a tribute to the Federal Reserve having done the right thing after mistakes that it made in 2021. And I give them substantial credit for having been prepared to take inflation very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the prospects for soft landing are better than they appeared, considerably better. Whether there will be a soft landing or not, I don't think we can be certain. I still have some residual concern about labor market-driven inflation. I have a concern that while inflation will decline for a while, given developments in the housing market, that it may subsequently increase as lower interest rates feed through the system. So I think serenity is misplaced. My guess is that the Fed will move a little bit less strongly than is now anticipated in the market, because I think there may be some over-discounting of inflation fears. But certainly we're in a better place than we looked like we were a year ago.
In Europe, we are wondering whether the ECB will reverse its monetary policy with interest rate cuts within 2024. What is your estimation?
I'm not sure. I think in Europe, the growth picture is less robust than in the United States. Europe is probably somewhat more vulnerable to the United States than the United States to supply shocks. Europe is also facing probably more geopolitical uncertainty, given that it is more proximate to both Ukraine and to the Middle East, and much more dependent on external sources for energy than the United States is. I think if I had to guess, there will be interest rate cutting in Europe in 2024, but just how much, I don't presume to be able to judge.
As you have already mentioned, recently geopolitics has created successive problems in the operation of supply chains. Is there any scenario that worries you more than the others?
I think I'm quite concerned about the reverberations from what happens in the Middle East. The prospect of Iran being drawn into full-scale conflict is not the scenario I would expect, but it is not the scenario that I can rule out either. And that potentially could have very substantial impacts on world energy markets, particularly on oil. I think you can't discount entirely the risk of accident, though I would say, all things considered, that the Taiwan election, especially given its outcome, everything has proceeded more smoothly there than I might have feared would be the case. But I think for the longer term, there's a major risk in terms of populist politics in many places in the world. I think if I had to identify the greatest risk in this moment, it's not climate change, It's not even hostility between countries, but it's the risk of populism.
So populism is a bigger threat than climate crisis.
That would be my judgment. In part because if you have populism, you also, among the many adverse consequences of populism, are that you will not see serious climate change.
Since we are doing this interview in Athens, I would like to also ask you about Greece. You were President Obama's chief economic advisor until the first months of the Greek crisis, if I'm not mistaken. What do you remember from that period? What were your first thoughts when the Greece's issue came up?
That this was a very serious issue, and that, like with most serious financial crises, you had a chicken and egg problem. You couldn't have a solution without strong action by the country. And strong action by the country was unlikely to succeed without very strong conditional support. And so you needed both to mobilize strong support and to have the country bring about strong action. Eventually, that's what happened, but it took a very long time. And Greece is probably going, when historians look back, it probably will have been a full generation during which per capita income in Greece made no progress. And for a society with the level of brain power and sophistication and connectedness and access that Greece has, that's a tragedy of epic proportions.
Some believe that a haircut on the Greek debt should have been decided from the first moment anyway, in 2010. What do you think?
I think that the ability to have provided haircuts was very much linked to Greece's ability to make fiscal adjustments. And that in the absence of Greece making fiscal adjustments, haircuts would not have been very availing. So I think that it needed to proceed in tandem, the policy adjustment and the provision of support. I would have liked to have seen stronger action taken with respect to Greece's debts, but I think in the context, it was very difficult, and particularly in the context of some of the Greek governments that followed in the middle of the last decade. It was very difficult for the international community to provide support in the face of the approach that those governments were taking. The fiscal consolidation and the debt relief needed to be provided in tandem. I think in the event, the ability that Greece got to stretch out its debt very substantially and to lock in very low long-term rates, even as interest rates in the world were rising very substantially, that in a market value sense represented a substantial reduction in the burden of Greece's debt, and has enabled the snowball effect to operate very much in Greece's favor. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that battlefield medicine is never perfect. And looking back, one can think of junctures where more should have been done. But I think the errors were certainly on both sides. Mm-hmm. I think the IMF is taking a less austerity-centered approach to crises these days. And that reflects lessons it learned in Greece. At the same time, I don't think that Greece can portray itself as an innocent victim.
You are now a member of the OpenAI board. This is something that happened in parallel with the return of Sam Altman as a CEO after his temporary removal. What will you try to achieve through your involvement in OpenAI? And what would you say is the biggest challenge for the company's activity, and by extension, also for AI, as it keeps moving forward?
This is profoundly important technology. you can make a case that rather than being compared to a particular invention, this is like the creation of the scientific method. It represents a new way of knowing and progressing for humanity. Ultimately, it's not just about solving problems we've identified better or doing tasks that we've done traditionally in better ways, but it's about recognizing opportunities and challenges we didn't before and formulating tasks we had not conceived before. So I think there is enormous potential here. But at the same time, there are obligations. There are obligations to do this as effectively and as efficiently as possible. It's a very competitive world, and it's very important that countries committed to a free approach to organizing human activity remain in the lead in a sphere this vital. So driving progress is very important. It's also the case that, as with any fundamentally new technology, there are risks as well as opportunities. Risks to privacy, risks of fakery, risks of the whole thing getting out of control. And I think all of that has to be weighed in the balance.
What role can the ChatGPT play in US elections?
I don't doubt that it will be used to create campaign materials. I don't doubt that it will facilitate a variety of kinds of communications. I think we'll all need to be very vigilant with respect to fraudulent or deceptive activity. And certainly the reason why OpenAI has the unique structure it does with a nonprofit that is the controlling owner of a for-profit entity is precisely to ensure appropriate sensitivity to a variety of kinds of risks, of which the one you mentioned is one.
Can you predict what would be the effect on the economic climate, both in the US and the Eurozone, if Donald Trump were to return to the White House?
I think in the short run, it could even be good for the United States. You know, if you looked at what happened to the Italian economy after Mussolini came in, or you looked at what happened to the Argentine economy on occasion when Perón came in, populism can be positive. But I think it's also the case that in the long run, the evidence is pretty clear that by reducing the capacity for contract, by substituting what might be called deals-based capitalism for what might be called rules-based capitalism, populism can be very unfortunate and toxic in its consequences. I suspect the adverse impacts might be felt even more quickly in Europe because for some reason, President Trump has not seen things in terms of a traditional set of Atlantic Western alliances, but instead has tended to gravitate in his loyalties and affections towards authoritarians and away from free societies. And that kind of rupture could be most serious for Europe.
You have previously served as president at Harvard. How do you explain the fact that many students refused to condemn the October 7th massacre in Israel?
It's tragic. I think it is not because they are not good people. It reflects a failing of memory. And as the events of the middle of the last century fade from the memory first of those who were alive, then of the parents of those who are alive, then of the grandparents of those who are alive, the risks that ancient hatreds can in some ways return are very much enhanced. So I have been profoundly troubled by the extent of anti-Semitism in many places, including on the Harvard campus. And I very much hope that progress will be made in educating people. Now, I want to be very clear that criticizing Israeli policy is fine. I was very sharply critical of Prime Minister Netanyahu on the question of judicial reform. Criticizing Israeli policy in ways that I would very much disagree with, by saying that a military response by Israel in Gaza is wrong. That is fine too. That's what ought to happen on a university campus where there ought to be debate. But raising the question of whether Israel should continue to exist as a Jewish
it's something different.
State, that is a very different and much more disturbing thing. And there is too much of that. And I have to say, I have been very disappointed in the inability of many of those who have led great universities to set a appropriate tone on their campuses.
Mm-hmm. And the last point, one of the factors that put pressure on prices internationally is also the trade confrontation between the US and China. Do you agree with Biden's politics here? Some even criticize the White House for protectionism.
I think it's responsible to attempt to maintain US technological leadership. I think it would be irresponsible not to try very hard to assure the resilience of the US economy by developing multiple sources of supply for every kind of important good. But at the same time, when I see policies advocated in terms of the number of jobs that they will create, I get very uncomfortable. And I think that's something that we need to be more aware of as we go forward.
Thank you, Mr. Summers.
Thank you.